Today's daf we're going to learn is Rosh Hashanah daf Kaftet. Today's daf is sponsored by Natalie Taylor in loving memory of her Professor Yaakov Ross, who passed away this past week on the 26th of Cheshvan. Today's daf is also sponsored by Emma Rimberg in loving memory of her dear friend Helen Taylor's stone setting. Helen is missed by her husband, children, grandchildren, and sisters, also by her close friends. We think of her often and miss her very much. May her memory be blessed. Okay. Reminder that the Siyum will be on Sunday, November 14th, in a week from today. So sign up, register, same registration as usual. You'll get your Zoom link right after you register, and you should get a reminder also just before. And if you live in Israel and you want to, or you're visiting Israel and you want to come to one of the local siyums, there's local siyums in different places. So also just a reminder, since, that's a little bit confusing, we're going to actually start Ta'anit on Sunday morning. And because the daf for Rosh Hashanah, the last daf is on Shabbat and our siyum's only Sunday. So we're going to start learning on regular, as usual, on Sunday morning. There will not be a daf put up before Shabbat. The daf will only go up after the siyum, the last daf. And so it will be a drop out of order, but we will finish that afternoon, evening, morning, depending on wherever you are. On Sunday, we'll finish Rosh Hashanah at the Siyum, and the daf for Tani will already be up from the morning. And if you want to join the Zoom will be on as usual. Okay, so again, there won't be a daf put up before Shabbat of the last daf. That we'll learn together at the Siyum. Okay, starting with the bottom of Kafchet Amud Bet, the very first few words, Amarle Rabbi Zera l'Shama'e. Rabbi Zera said to his Shamash, just to remind you what we're up to, our main topic at the end of yesterday's daf was about mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. Do you need intent to fulfill the mitzvah? What type of intent is needed to fulfill your mitzvah of blowing the shofar? So what did he say to his shamash? Ikaven utzkali. Have intent to have me fulfill the mitzvah through your shofar blowing and blow for me. Alma kasaver, he must hold. Mashmiya bai kavanah. He must hold that if the person who's blowing shofar, that the person who's blowing shofar needs to have intent to be motzi, to have someone else fulfill their obligation. So it's like if I make kiddush, okay? I was thinking about this. You're at a kiddush, there's a lot of people there. And someone's making kiddush for someone else or for, let's say their family or whatever it is. And I happen to be on the side listening. Can I fulfill my kiddush with that person? Because they don't really have me in mind. They don't even realize that I'm trying to fulfill my mitzvah of kiddush through them. So that's kind of the same idea, right? Whether it would be the same for kiddush and to get shofar, I'm not saying, I'm just saying that's the concept. Like that's where we might see this more often. So, or likely, if someone goes to blow shofar for you, you didn't make it to shul, they go to blow shofar for you in your house. Do they, obviously, right? In that case, it's pretty obvious. They obviously have intent to, when they blow, but, clearly, what this is saying is they have to have the intent to blow for you. The Gemara doesn't really like this, and they bring some questions on this. Meitive, but wait, it said in the Mishnah, our Mishnah, Haya over chorei beit hakneset, o shaya beito samuch lebeit hakneset, right? If you were passing behind the shul, or you lived right across the street from the shul, v'shama kol shofar o kol megillah, and you heard the sound of the shofar or the sound of the Megillah. Im kiven libo yatsa, v'im lav lo yatsa. Now, what did you need to do? All you need to do is have intent. Again, we had a whole discussion, what type of intent, but let's leave that aside. But if I'm walking behind the shul, I have intent, but who obviously doesn't have intent for me? The person blowing the shofar. Likely the person has intent for whoever's in the room, but I'm outside the shul. I'm in my house across the street. They don't even know of my existence. So, what does it help that I had kavana? The other person who's blowing the shofar certainly was not intending to blow shofar for me. So the Gemara responds, no. You're comparing apples and oranges. Shliach tzibur knows that their job is to be motzi whoever hears them. So they're basically, right, they're the representatives of the community. So when they blow the shofar, they have intent that whoever's in shul, whoever's outside of shul, whoever can hear my shofar, right, that I'm fulfilling their obligation. That's not the same as the example I brought before, where someone comes to your house to blow shofar because you didn't make it to shul. That's very different. They're coming to your house. Let's say someone's outside then listening and they hear the shofar going. Then Rabbi Zera would say that's a problem. Okay, so we resolved the first question against Rabbi Zera, but we have a second question. Tashma. We saw the source in yesterday's daf. Nitkaven shomea v'lo nitkaven mashmiya. Nitkaven mashmiya v'lo nitkaven shomea. Right? Both of them have to have intent. The one who's listening and the one who's blowing. One of them didn't have intent. Lo yatsa ad shitkaven shomea umashmiya. Doesn't work unless they both have intent. Now, how do we derive from this source anything? Well, katani mashmiya dumia deshomea. We do this very often. We have a Tanaitic source. Two things are juxtaposed to each other in that source. So if we have a mashmiya and we have a shomea, we're going to assume that they're the same, meaning, mas shomea, what type of intent does the shomea need? Shomea latzmo. He's intent that I want to be fulfilling the mitzvah, or at least hearing the shofar. Af mashmiya latzmo. The one who blows has to have intent that he's blowing the shofar, right, for the purposes of a mitzvah and not, for some other reason. So, or again, there was a debate. Maybe Shiur would be okay, but not something else. Anyway, depending on where you hold on that, but at least the intent is not intent for other people. It's intent for oneself. I'm blowing the shofar. I'm listening to the shofar, but not I'm blowing the shofar for someone else. So it sounds like Rav Katani lo yatzan. It says they're not yotze until both these happen, but once both those happen, you don't need intent to fulfill the obligation for somebody else. So how do we resolve that source? Well, that source is resolved simply by saying Tanaihi. This whole issue is a debate among Tanaim. And this source holds one way. Rabbi Zera holds by a different opinion. And we can in fact see this inside Detanya, as it says in a Braita. Shomea latzmo, umashmiya lefi darko. Again, this matches what we just said a minute ago, which is all the listener has to do, according to this opinion, is listen, right? And the bala tokea, the one blowing the shofar, just has to intend, right, to blow the shofar, not necessarily thinking about who they're blowing for. But Amar Rabbi Yossi, bamed dvarim amurim b'shliach tzibur. That's only for the shliach tzibur. This is very interesting, by the way. It shows that the shliach tzibur doesn't have to have in mind, I'm intending for everybody. By the nature of his job, he's automatically intending for everybody. It's not that he needs to think, that we assume the shliach tzibur is thinking about. No. He, almost by definition, his name is shliach tzibur. That means I'm a representative of everybody. Whatever he's thinking is just automatically for everybody, even if he doesn't actually think about it. But b'yachid lo yatsa ad shitkaven shomea umashmiya. But if it's an individual, then it's only until the shomea intends to fulfill the obligation and the mashmiya intends to fulfill the obligation for the shomea, for the listener. So therefore, they end up saying, Rabbi Zera must hold by that opinion, and that resolves the problem against him. So what we saw until now was Rabbi Zera, who told the shamash, have intent for me and let me fulfill my obligation through your shofar blasts. And then we had two questions. One we kind of resolved, and then the second one we resolved in a different way by saying, it's a Tana, it's a debate among Tanaim. Now we have a bit of a strange Mishnah stuck in the middle here of the Masechet. Our last Mishnah ended with exactly this case of someone who's going behind a shul, right? It's all about your intent. Im kiven libo yatsa, lo kiven libo lo yatsa. So now we're talking about this issue of kavanat halev. Now we move into a totally different kavanat halev. Okay, and we'll talk about whether they're really totally different or not, but it seems very different. There it's all about, right? And it even ends with this line, Afal pisha zeh shama v'zeh shama. It's almost like this line is a lead-in. You might have thought that line was a little unnecessary at the end of yesterday's Mishnah. Even though this one heard and this one heard, this one had intent and this one didn't have intent. Like you look at two people and you think they're all thinking the same thing, but it's very different. Okay, one has to intend, the other one doesn't need to, right? The other one didn't intend. So if you intended, it's a whole different story to fulfill your mitzvah. You had no intent, you didn't fulfill your mitzvah at all. Now, the next Mishnah talks about different type of intent, okay, but similarly, the idea of intent. Pasuk in Sefer Shmot, where it talks about the battle with Amalek right after they got out of Egypt. And the famous story when Moshe kept his arms up and Aaron and Hur were standing on his sides, holding his hands up. And as long as his hands were up, the Jews were winning. His hands went down, they'd lose. Here, there's this great translation, right? Make or break, right? We say make or break, right? The hands of Moshe would make or break the war. Seems very strange. So what's the idea here? he would hold his hands up. What would that do? That would kind of signal to the people, look up. And if the people would look up and think about God and fight the battle with the thought of God, God is on our side, then, and mishabdim libam avihem shebashamayim, right? They basically say, we understand that it's not all about us and that God is helping us, then they would win. And if not, they would fall. So again, two people doing the exact same action. They're both fighting the war, but one has intent toward God and one doesn't, right? It's a whole different story. Or the people, right? They could do the same action, but if they're facing toward God, then yes, and not no. And kayotze b'davar ha'talmud, that's on the chat, someone mentioned this, you'll see it's right here. Same thing. Aseh lecha saraf v'sim oto al nes. In the desert, there was a time people complained again, and God brought the nechashim, these snakes that were biting the people, and Moshe prayed for forgiveness, and God said, make this fiery thing, put it in a furnace, and simot al nes, and then basically make this image of a snake made out of copper, put it at a high place. That's what al nes means. Nes is not a miracle here. It's on a banner. A nes is a banner. Up so everyone can see. Vaya, or on a pole. Anyone who was bitten by the snake would look at it and would live. Now, same thing. What? This snake is it's really a serpent, I should say. The serpent is what kills, and the serpent is what brings to life. Ella. Now, it was up on, that's why I said it is like a banner, something high up. When they looked up at God and they realized God is behind this and they believed in God, then they were saved. And if not, they would die. Now, the Mishnah then goes on to a totally different halacha about who's obligated in shofar, who's not, who can be mostly other people. Okay, before we get to that part of the Mishnah, really the Mishnah should have broken here. Probably, the truth is I didn't look in a book of Mishnayot. It might actually be separate, but there is no Gemara on this Mishnah, so therefore they just go on to the next Mishnah. Now, what is this doing in the middle here, and what's the idea here? So I read, actually, unfortunately, it didn't say who wrote it, but on Drisha's website in English, they have a whole section on Mishnayot, and there's a great analysis of this Mishnah. And it says there that, I like to say things b'shem omro, but it wasn't mentioned there who wrote it. So they talk here about this idea. First of all, they compare it to the Mechilta. The same thing appears in the Mechilta with a very different message. The message there is, this was all miraculous. It was all God. It had nothing to do with the people. And the message of the Mishnah is, it's all about what the people were doing. This wasn't a miracle. This was a way Moshe picked up his hands so that the people would look up at God and believe in God, right? It was a way of a means of getting the people to believe. And if they did, then it would happen, right? Which is all the theme of what we're talking about, kavanah, right? If you think about the theme of Rosh Hashanah also, and even Kiddush HaChodesh, it's all about the involvement of people in it, right? And the Mechilta, which is a Midrash Halacha from the same time period as the Mishnah, the story is told in a very different way. It's all saying God is the orchestrator of everything, which is exactly the opposite of our Masechet, right? Our Masechet is all about Kiddush HaChodesh. You determine. It's up to you. We had the whole debate about, halacha changing, and it's all about the rabbis. They determine, right? Even if it's not the truth, right? The Rabbi Shiur, Rabban Gamliel story. This also, it's about the people's involvement. That's what Rosh Hashanah is all about. It's about you figuring out what you're going to do for the year, who you want to be. It's all about your part in the world and what you do. So it's interesting. The Mishnah is trying to focus in on this issue. And then in the article, they compare between, they say, yes, it looks different. The kavanah you need to be yotzei shofar, right? Versus the kavanah that we're talking about here, which is connecting to God. And what they said very beautifully is the first stage is to have kavanah for the mitzvah, right? Or kavanah even just to hear it. And from there, you get to kavanah, right? The real kavanah, which is understanding about God and doing things for the sake of God. So it kind of was like a lead-in that is the first stage, which gets you to this next stage of kavanah, which is really the ultimate goal, right? The goal of mitzvot is to bring us closer to God. So I thought that was a nice idea. Again, it's probably a little more developed than I explained, but that's in a nutshell. Okay, next part of the Mishnah. These are the famous category of 3. We'll get into more detail, certainly in Chagiga, about this cheresh shotev katan, where they talk about which type of cheresh comes up in other places. Usually they say also deaf and also mute, not only deaf or only mute. So cheresh shotev katan, again, there's different opinions about it. I'm not going to get into it right now, but these 3 people are considered not to have da'at, not to have intelligence. Okay? And a minor, obviously, right? And a shoteh is someone who's not fully cognitively there. So these three people cannot blow shofar and fulfill the obligation for other people who are actually obligated in shofar. Now the Mishnah doesn't list who's obligated in shofar, who isn't. Okay, it just says zaklal, right? It mentions at least those three people. There's more, like for example, women. Women are actually exempt from shofar. We now know women all go to shul and hear shofar, and it's a big deal. That's developed later. Okay, we'll talk about it more tomorrow as women come up more in tomorrow's stuff. So here it just says, this is the rule. If you're not obligated, then you can't blow shofar for other people. They won't fulfill their obligation through you. This comes up in many, many circumstances where you have to be on the same level of obligation in order to help someone else fulfill a mitzvah. Tanu Rabbanit. Okay, so we'll get to women and all that tomorrow. Okay, but in the meantime, we'll reference it a little bit in this next Breita. So Tanu Rabbanit, the Breita says, Hakol chayavim b'tkiyat shofar, kohanim uleviim v'yisraelim. Okay, so that's pretty obvious. The Gemara is going to say, if not them, then who else? Okay, right? That basically covers all the Jewish people, kohanim, leviim, and Yisraelim, all Jews that are born Jews. Okay, now we're going to get to anyone who wasn't born Jewish, gerim, converts, avadim meshucharim, freed slaves. These are Canaanite slaves who become freed slaves when they become free. We've mentioned this many times. They become Jewish. Vitumtum, right? They're already semi-Jewish before, but they're exempt from time-bound mitzvah. Shofar is a time-bound mitzvah. That's why women are exempt. That's why avadim, knaanim are exempt. But if they're free, then they're obligated. Tumtum v'androginus. Okay, there are categories that come up a lot in the Gemara. Tumtum is someone whose genitals are hidden. They're like a piece of skin over it or something, and no one knows if they're male or female. So it's a safek. Maybe they're male, maybe they're female. Androginus has both genitalia of male and female. So they're both male and female. So we'll see the difference between them in 1 minute. Someone who is half slave, half free. How could that be? You have two masters, one freed them, one didn't. So they're considered half this, half that. And all those people are obligated in shofar. Each one because of, right, either the tumtum because maybe they're male, the androgynous because it has a male element to him, and the chetio eved and chetio ben cholim has a free element to him. So that makes him obligated. Tumtum, but because they're in this in-between stage, tumtum eino motzi lo et mino v'lo et she'eno mino. Can't, well, the second part is easier to understand. Tumtum can't be motzi someone who's obligated for sure because he's only obligated out of a doubt. Also can't be motzi another tumtum who's at the same level as him because one tumtum could be, we don't know, male or female. So maybe that person's female. And then the other one maybe is male. And therefore he's actually, or she is a female, can't fulfill the obligation for the male. So that would be the tumtum's problem. Androgynous, since it has both male and female, it is considered male and therefore motzi et mino can fulfill the obligation for another androgynous because there it's really a doubt about how we treat an androgynous. Do we treat it as a male or a female? But all androgynuses are the same basically. So then, but not avalo et she'eno mino, but because maybe we treat the androgynous also by the female side, which is not obligated, therefore can't. The androgynous can't fulfill the obligation for someone who's actually obligated. What about that person? Can't fulfill the obligation for another eved, or who's also half-half, or even someone who's not like him. So basically for nobody. We'll get back to this soon. So the Gemara starts off. That was just a quote from the Breita. So now we're going to go part by part. Amar ma. Pshita. Isn't that obvious? Ooh, right, and it says it very well. If these people aren't obligated, then who is? Like that's basically the main people of the Jewish people. So the Gemara says, Kohanim itzri chale. They really wanted to mention Kohanim, and we'll see in a minute. They really mean Kohanim and Leviim. Why? First, they think only Kohanim, and then we'll get to why Leviim also. The first option is to say, Sakadat hachamina ho'il uchtiv yom t'shua yelachem. Now, what is yom t'shua yelachem? This is a description of Rosh Hashanah. it will be a day of shofar blasts, which means, right, if I say we're having a Yom sport in school, like a sports day, that means it's a once a year sports day, right? So a Yom Truah is a once a year blowing shofar activity. Now, why is that not relevant to Kohanim? So man delete ela b'tkiya dechad yoma hu d'mechayev. The only ones who are obligated for someone who this is a day of shofar blast. It's unique. But Hani Kohanim who ilvi neu b'tkiyot kol hashana. Kohanim are not part of tkiyot of the entire year. I'm sorry, they're not. They are blowing shofar all year. Why are they blowing shofar all year? Because they will blow the shofar, or we'll see in a minute, really the chatzotzot. Okay, dichtiv u'tkakitem chatzotzot al olotechem. They would blow the chatzotzot whenever they brought korbanot olah. Now, there's a debate how to understand this. Is it whenever they brought korbanot olah? Okay, this is in Sefer Bamidbar when it talks about all the cases that you blow the chatzotzot, the trumpets. So there's a debate among the commentaries. Some say they would blow the shofar every single day when they brought the korban tamid. Some people say they only blew the shofar when, like it was Rosh Chodesh, any holiday, on a special day. But still, for that, even if you say it was special days, there's, let's say, 20 special days. Well, there's probably more. There's 12 Rosh Chodeshim. There's all the Chagim, right? So you would end up with a lot of special days of the year. And then Yom Truah is not so special for them because they've already done it many times. So for them, maybe Yom Truah is not unique for them since they blow the shofar many times, even though it's really the trumpets, not the shofar. We'll get to that in a minute. So maybe they're not obligated in Tkiyat Shofar. That's why it says Kohanim. The Gemara says, what are you talking about? Midame. That's not the same. We've already made this whole big distinction between the chatzotzot and the shofar. Just because they blow the chatzotzot all year round doesn't mean they blow the shofar all year round. That's not the same thing. That shouldn't prove anything. Yom Truah is still a special day for them. So move on. That's not a good answer. So second option. Remember we said Yovel is the same in the Yovel year for Rosh Hashanah, right? And for the Yovel year is the same as Rosh Hashanah for shofar blasts and bracha. So now you might think, Yovel, right? Before we were trying to say that in the Yovel year, they do it just like they do on Rosh Hashanah. But now they're saying also the reverse. Who does it in Yovel? For whoever, in other words, Yovel is unique to those who Yovel has special laws for. Now, we're going to see in a minute, the Kohanim and Leviim are a little bit out of the mitzvot of Yovel for certain things. The Hane Kohanim, since they're not part of the mitzvot of Yovel, maybe they wouldn't have to blow shofar because shofar, Rosh Hashanah is like Yovel. And since Yovel, the Kohanim are a little bit on the outs, and we'll see the Kohanim and the Leviim. Therefore, you might have thought that maybe shofar isn't for them. And that's why it comes to teach you it is. Now, in what way are they on the outs? Ditzanan, as it says in the Mishnah, Kohanim u'Leviim mochlim la'olam v'goalim la'olam. Okay, you need some background, which is, we've talked about this before. It's different laws about different types of land. The whole idea of Yovel is the land goes back to its original owner on the Yovel year. Now, normally what happens, you sell land because you're in need of money. That was generally why they sold land in those days. So they sold land. If you sell land, you have X amount of time to buy it back. It depends what kind of land it is and all different kinds of things. I'm not going to get into all this right now, whether you're in a walled city, not a walled city, right? The land also goes back only in certain, I'm not going to get into all the details, but the main thing is that you have X amount of time to buy back the land. If you don't, then you don't have rights to buy it back anymore. However, in the Yovel year, it will go back to you. This law is not true for Kohanim and Leviim. They can always buy back their land, okay? There's no such limitation on them. If they sold land because they needed money and then they got money 5 years later, they'd be able to buy the land. So since that law of Yovel doesn't apply to them, you might have thought shofar blowing doesn't apply to them. Therefore, you might have thought they weren't obligated. That's why the Braita specifies Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisraelim. Don't think it's just like Yovel. Okay, we're getting sort of hints here about, it's not exactly sure what this kind of hint is, but about the meaning of shofar, or at least possible understandings of it. Like here, they connect it very much to Yovel. Soon we're going to connect it to the temple and sacrifices. And even the first one connected it with sacrifices. Okay, I'll even show you already right now. If you look at the sheet from today, I put it on the sheet, which is the verses that talk about shofar in the Torah are mentioned right next to, and Safrai points this out. I didn't notice it myself. He pointed it out, and I thought it was a very strong, compelling argument If you look in Vayikra Kaf Gimel, for example, in Kaf Daled Kaf He, it says, the Psukim Kaf Daled Kaf He, Daber al b'nei Yisrael emor, b'chodesh hashvi'i be'echad l'chodesh yeh lechem Shabbaton, zichron tru'ah mikra kodesh. Okay, so on the 7th month, the first of the month, it will be a Shabbat day for you. Zichron tru'ah, remembrance of the tru'ah. We'll talk about this in a minute, the difference between Zichron tru'ah and Yom tru'ah. We'll get back there. Kol malachet avodah lo ta'asu v'kavtem mishel Hashem. Don't do any work and sacrifices. In Bamidbar Kaftet, it says, it's a bit of a different order. The malachak there comes first. In Vayikra Kaf Gimel, it was, right, Trua, malacha, sacrifice. Here it starts with malacha. Then it says, Yom Trua Yelachem, and then it says, Vasita Malal Reach Nichach. So notice in all those, there's the same 3 elements. There's not doing work, there's blowing the shofar, and there's sacrifices. So what Safrai claims is that there's obviously, he thinks obviously, again, one can argue, there's this link between shofar and sacrifices. And this would make sense in the context of, the Kohanim and the connection between the Kohanim and the first option, which tried to connect. For the Kohanim, this is what they do every day. When they bring sacrifice, they blow the shofar, fine, it's the chatzot throat, and what we're doing is we're taking it outside, not just for Kohanim and in the temple, but also outside the temple. We'll get back to this idea when we discuss what happens on Shabbat. Okay, that's going to be the first mission in the next chapter, which we're going to get to momentarily. Okay. So I'll leave this topic aside. I kind of opened it. We're going to close it up, or at least maybe open up more issues about it in a few minutes. We're continuing now in the Braita. Misha chetzio eved v'chetzio ben cholin. Eno motzi lo et mino v'lo et she'eno mino. Amar Rav Huna, ulatzmo motzi. Okay, you can fulfill for yourself. You can, the eved, what he says is, look, it seems implied from the Mishnah. The Mishnah says can't fulfill the obligation for someone like him or anyone else. But it sounds like he can't fulfill the obligation for himself. He could blow shofar for himself. Wait a minute. Why can't he fulfill the obligation for other people? Because he's got one side of him that's free and one side that's a slave. The slave side of him can't be motzi the free side of another person. Well, let's just take that to himself. He's made up of both sides. So the slave side of him shouldn't be able to fulfill the obligation for the free side of him. The assumption is when he blows with his whole body. And he's made up of 2 different conflicting things. So, right? The tzad avdut shebo can't fulfill the obligation for the tzad, the free part of him, of another person. So, la'atz monami, for himself also. Lo ate tzad avdut didei, his slave side shouldn't be able to fulfill the obligation for his free side. So therefore, Rav Nachman disagrees with Rav Huna, and El Amar Rav Nachman aflatz moino motzi. Says clearly he shouldn't be able to fulfill the obligation even for himself. Tanya namihachi, Braita to support Rav Nachman. Misha chetzio eved b'chetzio ben cholin aflatz moino motzi. And here it says it explicitly in the Braita, a different Braita, that he doesn't fulfill the obligation for himself. Tane ava b'reit Rabbi Zera. Okay, remember we started with Rabbi Zera, who asked his shamash, blow the shofar for me. Now we have his son named Ahava, interesting name. And he said, Kol abrachot kulam. Now we're taking this topic somewhere else, talking about fulfilling obligations for other people in other areas. Kol abrachot kulam af al pi she'atza motzi. Even if you already fulfilled your obligation, when it comes to mitzvot or brachot in general, you can make a bracha for somebody else. This is based on this concept, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Bazeh. We're all responsible for each other. Therefore, if someone needs a bracha made for them, I can make that bracha for them, even if I already fulfilled my obligation. However, there's one big exception to the rule. And the question is, how far do we take that exception? Other than if you're talking about food, or what we call birchat haneni, any kind of food-related blessing or pleasure. If I'm about to derive pleasure from something and I'm obligated to make a bracha on it before I derive pleasure, which is usually eating, plus to other things as well, I am not allowed to make a blessing for you if I have already done it. Okay? If I ate bread at a meal and I made hamotzi, and now you come and you want me to make hamotzi for you for whatever reason, I don't know why you don't want to do it yourself, I cannot do it for you. Okay, but if it was something else, there was a mitzvah, like I lit Hanukkah candles and you didn't, and I want to light Hanukkah candles again, it seems like I'd be able to light for you. Okay. By Rava. Rava says, well, what about Birkat HaLechem Shel Matzah or Birkat HaYayin Shel Kiddush HaYom Out? Let's take something that has a combination of a Birkat HaMitzvah and a Birkat HaNanim, like Kiddush. Kiddush, you make Borei Pragafen, and you make Mekadesh HaShabbat. So can I make Kiddush for you and say the bracha of Borei Pragafen? Borei Pragafen is Birkat HaNanim. I'm not allowed to say a few if I was already Yotze Kiddush, but in this case, am I allowed to? So do we say, Kevan dechovahu mapik. Kiddush is an obligation of the Torah. So is eating matzah on the first night of Pesach. So am I allowed to, right? We're not talking about challah on Shabbos, which is a mitzvah, but it's not the same level mitzvah. It's not a Torah obligation. So am I allowed to make the bracha of hamotzi for you to have you fulfill your obligation if I've already done it? Odilma bracha lav chovahi. Or maybe you say, I'm obligated to eat the matzah, but I'm not obligated to make the Birkat HaNanim. I mean, I'm obligated, but that's not the obligation I'm trying to fulfill is the obligation of the mitzvah. And that's not the same as the bracha of the Birkat HaNanim that I say along with it. So how do we view it? So Tashma, let's learn from here. Amar Ravashi, ki avina be Rav Papi have a mekadesh lan. When I was at Rav Papi's house, he would make Kiddush for all of us. So far, that didn't mean anything. He was obligated in Kiddush as well. We have to find a case where he wasn't obligated in Kiddush, where he already fulfilled his obligation. When his sharecroppers would come in from the fields later, he would make Kiddush for them. First of all, why are his sharecroppers coming in later? Wasn't it Shabbos? So some people say, well, they stopped their work just before Shabbos came in, and by the time they got home, the people had already made Kiddush. Okay, and they were like the second shift. Okay, obviously these were in the times where there was no Lecha Dodi and Kabbalat Shabbat, and davening was much quicker. And I guess they brought in Shabbos already, and he basically, the sharecroppers missed it, so he would make Kiddush for them again, including the Borei Pragafen, which would mean that yes, you can make Kiddush again, and we do this. Right? People are always making Kiddush even on Shabbos morning when there is no Mikadesh Shabbat. It's just Borei Pragafen. People make Kiddush for other people. Okay, so we view this, and even though that's not Doraita, it's interesting. This is almost like asking more on the Doraita obligation. Anyway, it seems like you can do it. Tanu Rabbanan, lo yifros adam prusa leorchim elem ken ochel imahen. Here's a braita that says also you can't cut a piece of bread and make a bracha on them unless you're eating with them. Aval poresu lebanav ulivnei beito kedei lechancham b'mitzvot. But however, and this is very interesting, and I'll tell you something very interesting that comes out of this, you can do it for your sons and your household members kedei lechancham b'mitzvot, in order to have them learn how to do mitzvot. Now, normally you would think this means chinuch, right? Children, so that when they get older, they'll know how to do it. So basically you could say the bracha, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, when you're teaching kids to make bracha, right? And motzi lechem min haaretz, even if you're not actually eating. So the Ritva says, this is clear from here that bracha levatala is not, or using God's name in vain, right, is not a deoraita. Okay, now where does bracha levatala come up? It comes from lo tisat shem Hashem lashaf, which is in the 10 Commandments. Don't use God's name in vain. The question is it just connected to that verse, or does it really come out of that verse? So some people think it's actually deoraita, and they take bracha much more, seriously in terms of when you can use them or not. The Ritva says, from here you see that it's Rabbanit. And B'nai Beito are the women in the house, not just for din chinuch, but even for the women in the house. And he basically takes us to a place, this is, from Nashim Somchot L'Reshut, and all the cases where women, they want to do mitzvot, they're allowed to, and he comes from here to the conclusion that women who take upon mitzvah, right, this is where there's this whole big debate, can they make a bracha or not? Different Sephardim Ashkenazim generally. Within Sephardim, there's two different thoughts, and in fact, the Ritva is Sephardi. He's clearly from one train of thought that it's okay to make mitzvot, because here you see, so it's okay to make bracha on mitzvot that you're not obligated in, because here the husband can make the bracha for the wife, even though she's not necessarily obligated, because lechancham b'mitzvot he takes in a much broader thing to say there's a value involved. There's values to women doing mitzvot, even if they're not obligated in them, right? Something we firmly believe in. But there's no, if I can do a mitzvah, why shouldn't I be doing it? There's a value involved. And therefore, he takes it from here that we can make brachot on things that we're not obligated. And again, not everyone agrees with him. There's difference of opinion about it. Generally, Ashkenazi psak is yes, and within Sephardi psak, there's different opinions about it. And the Braita continues, B'Halel u'B'Megillah afa pi she'yatza motzi. In Halel and Megillah, even though you already fulfilled your obligation, you can clearly be motzi, because again, that doesn't involve a birkat hanenim at all. Hadron alach re'u beitin, and with that, we finish the third parak, starting our very last parak of Rosh Hashanah. Okay, to understand this Mishnah, we have to go back to what it was like in the time of the temple and then in the time of the destruction of the temple. And you have to imagine yourselves for this next section you're living right when the temple's destroyed and we need a new reality, okay? How do we deal with what's happening? And who's one of the main characters? Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, who's sitting in Yavne, where the Sanhedrin had moved actually before the destruction of the temple already to Yavne. And he's there in Yavne, right? He's the famous Ten li Yavne v'chachameh, right? Give me Yavne and the Chachamim, right? That's all I want. Give me Yavne, leave us alone. And that's going to be where we rule from. Anyway, he makes the lulav and the yomanef. We saw him in Sukkah. We're going to see that Mishnah again. It's going to come up here also. The Mishnah is repeated in Masechet Rosh Hashanah. That's tomorrow. But right now we're going to talk about shofar on Shabbat. Okay, very interesting topic. I don't know if you know, but people nowadays have been trying to say maybe if we have a beitin, we could. Rav Steinsaltz was known to say we should be able to blow shofar in certain places in nowadays and bring back that idea. It comes all from this sugya. Yom Tov shel Rosh Hashanah shechal liyot b'Shabbat. So you have Yom Tov and Rosh Hashanah that falls on Shabbat. B'mikdash hayu tokin v'lo b'medina. They would blow the shofar in the temple. This is in the time of the temple. Shofar was always blown in the temple on Shabbat. V'lo b'medina, not in outside. Okay, now what is Medina? Usually it means outside the temple. The Rambam disagrees with the Ravid and others about when they say Mikdash here, do they mean all of Jerusalem? And you'll see the Rambam says that. And you'll see that the Sugya seems to indicate all of Jerusalem, not just in the temple, versus the Ravid, the Rid, and others who say just in the temple, not outside the temple. And then they have a little bit of a difficulty explaining some of the Sugyas we're going to see, or some of the sources. Mishacharav Beit HaMikdash, Hitkin Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, Shiur tokin b'kol makom sheyesh bo beitin. Okay, so Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says, any place where there's a court. Now, the problem is we're going to have three different interpretations what exactly Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted. Right now, we have Tanakama's opinion about what he instituted. We don't have Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai talking here. He said any place where there's a court, you can blow the shofar. Amar Rabbi Elazar, at this point, we have no idea what the issue is of blowing shofar on Shabbat. Okay, we'll get to that later, and we'll see that our Gemara has one reason, and I'll quote you two from the Yerushalmi that are very different. Amar Rabbi Elazar, second opinion. So just in Yavne, not any place where there's a beitin. Amrulo, the rabbis responded to him. This is presumably a third opinion, even though it sounds very much like the first. And we're going to end today's stuff with what's the difference between option number one, which said any place where there's a court, and option number two, which is the option number three here, where the rabbi said to Rabbi Elazar, Yavne and anywhere else there's a court. It sounds like so why is this listed as three separate? We're going to have to figure out. Furthermore, the Mishnah says there was one other way in which Jerusalem was greater than Yavne. In other words, even though they instituted in Yavne, yes, you could blow the shofar, still there was this difference. Any city that could see, could hear, and was close to Jerusalem, and could theoretically come to Jerusalem, tokin, supports the Rambam very clearly that you could blow the shofar on Shabbat, even in a place that was near Jerusalem, or for sure in Jerusalem. Okay, I want you to just pay attention. We'll get back to this at the Siyum. I'm going to kind of do a whole overview of the Masechet, where there's Re'iyah and Shmi'ah. Okay, I want you to start paying attention to these things. We've been talking about Re'iyah, like the whole first two chapters were all about seeing the new moon. The second two chapters are all about hearing the shofar. And here it's interesting, they're playing these two words together. Any city that could hear or see Jerusalem, right? But it's clearly a reference to the seeing and the hearing and these important elements that relate to everything in our Masechet and could come below. But when it was Yavne, was the Sanhedrin was there, then they would only blow in the Beitin and not outside the court. So the Gemara says, where do we get this from? First answer, Amar Rabbi Levi bar Lachma, Amar Rabbi Chama bar Chanina. Where do we get that you can't blow shofar on Shabbat outside the temple? Shabbat, Katuv Echad Omer Shabbaton Zichron Truah, Katuv Echad Omer Yom Truah Yelachem. Those are the psukim I quoted before. And if you notice in our davening on Rosh Hashanah, when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, we use the word Zichron Truah. And when it falls not on Shabbat, we say Yom Truah. And that's based on this Gemara. It says, what's the difference? Why is one a remembrance of the Truah? One is actually a day of Truah. Lo kashya kan be Yom Tov shechal liyot b'Shabbat, kan be Yom Tov shechal liyot b'chol. On Shabbat, you're not allowed to, and that's why it says Zichron Truah. And that, according to this opinion, it's a deoraita law that you can't do it. Now, why in the Mikdash would it be allowed? And in fact, you're going to see Rava rejects this, but the Yerushalmi brings this opinion as an opinion. And basically you'd have to say that there's a gzeret hakatuv, like there's some clear thing that in the mikdash should override Shabbat, just like in the mikdash other things overrode Shabbat. But Rava doesn't like this, okay? And that's opinion number one in the Yerushalmi, that Doraita you can, but mikdash is different. And then you'd have to say, if Yavne replaces the mikdash, and in Yavne it's allowed, you're going to have to say, and this is in terms of very important to understand the transition, basically Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is saying, according to that opinion both in the Gemara here and quoted in the Yerushalmi, that the mikdash is being replaced by Yavne. Yavne is our mikdash, basically. It's saying we have a new mikdash now. It's no longer the same as it was there, but Yavne is our mikdash. According to option number two, okay, which is in Rava, Amar Rava, he's had two problems with that opinion. He doesn't think that if it's doraita, we could just say, oh yeah, well, we could blow the shofar on Shabbat in the mikdash. No, he doesn't like that. Remember, anytime we did that, it was always b'moado. There was some proof that it overrides Shabbat. This doesn't have that. It's not a malacha, it's kiyat shofar. It's not asur b'malacha to blow the shofar. It's not one of the lamed tet malachot that you would need a pasuk to say, no, you can't. Right? Or yes, you can, or whatever. Like we need a pasuk to say it's not a malacha at all. How do we know it's not a malacha? Detan to Beit Shmuel, in the house of Beit Shmuel. In other words, what he's saying is if it's a malacha, and then they would have to say, you can't do it. It's not a malacha. Because in the house of Shmuel, they bring this braita, kol malacha d'avodah lo tasu, yatztat kiyat shofar u'ridiat hapat she'i chachma ve'ena malacha. If you remember, we learned about this ridiat hapat. It's taking the bread off. It was stuck to the sides of the oven. These two things are called chokhmah. They're not malacha. They're not actually forbidden by Torah law. Most people say they're forbidden by rabbinic law, but they're not forbidden by Torah law. So he says, I don't agree with you. This is clearly a Torah thing. So then he says, Elam arava midoraita mishrashari. Really, on a doraita level, you could actually blow the shofar. The Rabbanit who degaz rabba, kiderabba. The rabbis forbade it for the reason of Rabba. Remember the famous Gzera de Rabba? We had a number of times already. Everyone's obligated, but not everybody knows how to do it. This is still true today. Gzeira, therefore, they forbade it because you might go to take your shofar then to have someone teach you on Rosh Hashanah. And right, only on Shabbat is the problem of carrying it for Amon and Rishon Rabim, and therefore we don't allow shofar. Okay, some people add, by the way, there's an issue of you might have to, like, why doesn't they talk about this, the concern that you might, like the instruments, you can't use musical instruments because you might have to fix them. Okay, that's another question why it doesn't say that. Anyway, he says, V'hainu Tamid de Lulav, V'hainu Tamid de Megillah, we know this already, right? Lulav and Megillah, same thing. So then in Yavne, why would they allow it? Well, Beit Din knows to make sure that it doesn't get carried, right? And that's the difference, Beit Din and individual. There's a third opinion in the Yerushalmi, which is second in the Yerushalmi, but third altogether, which is there's an issue that we're not sure it's for sure Aleph B'Tishrei. The only place where you're sure is in the Beit Din, and therefore Yavne clearly takes the place of the Sanhedrin because they're the ones who determine Kiddush Chodesh. So in Yavne, they can do it because they know exactly for sure that this is the day. Anywhere else, they're not going to be sure that this is the day, and therefore that's another possible reason. So there's three different reasons to understand it. Gemara continues. Very interesting story. I'll just mention that we're going to see the Bnei B'Tera. The last time we saw the Bnei B'Tera was with Hillel Hazaken many generations before. There obviously were a family that continued to be central. The Bnei B'Tera asked this big question in the time of Hillel Hazaken. We're talking Hillel and Shammai in the Zugot way before. They asked, what do we do? Can Pesach, the Korban Pesach, override Shabbat? And nobody knew the answer. And Hillel Bavli comes and tells the answer. Yes, it overrides Shabbat. And they make Hillel the leader at that point. Okay, that's the first story with them. Tanu Rabbanit. So again, they're going to have this question about what do we do on Shabbat. It's interesting that it's the same kind of issue. Everybody came to Yavne to kind of hear the shofar blow. Amar lehem Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai, the Bnei B'Tera nitkas. Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai says, now probably this was the first Rosh Hashanah after the Churban that fell on Shabbat. So Rabban Yochanan and Zakkai says, let's blow the shofar. And he says to Bnei B'Tera, because obviously they were an important family. Amrulo, they said to him, Nadun, let's open it for discussion. Amar lehem nitkav achar kach nadun. First, we're going to blow the shofar. Then I'm happy to open to discussion with you. So they listened to him because he was the leader. Amru lo nadun. So they blow the shofar. And then they said, okay, let's open it up now for discussion. Amar lahem, kfar nishma'a keren b'yavne ve'em shivin lachar maseh. Well, we already blew, so we're not going to start opening this for discussion. Then it'll look bad if we decide otherwise, and we already blew. So no, sorry, discussion's closed. Okay, he a little bit tricked them, obviously, or maybe a lot tricked them. And first of all, there's a funny reference. Keren b'yavne sounds like Keren b'yavne with a kaf and a mem instead of a kuf and a nun. But Keren b'yavne is what they called the Sanhedrin there because it was like rows of a vineyard. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting thing. But he basically, I think, is establishing his authority here and saying, I'm the one who's deciding what goes on in Yavne, and everyone will listen to me. And this story is kind of his way of saying it. Interesting, the B'nai B'Tera were important people, but yet both times they kind of get put in their place and get kind of demoted on the scale. Okay, last line. Amar Rabbi Elazar, lo hitkin Rabban Yochanan Zakai al b'Yavne b'vad, amru lo echad Yavne b'chal kom kon sheish bo beitin. Again, this is the response, and then the Gemara is going to ask, Amru lo hainu tanakama. It's the same thing. It's saying, only in Yavne and any other Beit Din, not just Yavne alone, which is what Rabbi Elazar said, but both the other opinions seem to be saying any other court. So they answer, Ika benayu Beit Din da'akad. A Beit Din that's not a set Beit Din is the nafkamina. Tanakama will say, Tanakama said there in the Mishnah, Lo itkin elabia, so you took him b'kol makom sheish bo Beit Din. Kol makom sheish bo Beit Din sounds like any place where there's a court, even if it's not a set court. Some people say this means a court of 3. Rather than a court of 23, and that maybe right there were courts of 3, 23, and 71, and that Rabbi Elazar was saying 71. The Amrulo is saying 23. Yavne, or a court, meaning a court like Yavne, which would have to be, a more established court, like of 23 people. And the Tanakama is saying even if it's a court of 3, they can blow the shofar. Okay, we'll stop here. We're going to continue more on this issue tomorrow. Have a Shavua Tov, everyone.